My name is Ginger J. Bradley. I am 27 years old. I wasn't even fully awake when the screaming started. It was my sister's voice first, sharp and high, echoing down the hallway before my eyes could open all the way. My body felt like it had been filled with wet sand. Heavy, unresponsive. My mouth was dry, my head throbbed, and my chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the accident. I couldn't tell if it was morning or night. The fluorescent lights above me offered no clues, only a dull humming blur. The last thing I remembered clearly was the sound of metal folding in on itself, my car spinning, a stranger yelling that help was coming. Then sirens, then nothing. Now I was here, tangled in wires, one arm wrapped in a sling, my leg braced, bruises blooming across my ribs like something trying to surface. My sister Tessa stood at the edge of my bed as if she were inspecting damage she didn't believe was real. My mother went straight to the chair by the window, already scrolling through her phone like this was an inconvenience she planned to wait out. Neither of them asked how I felt. Neither of them touched me. "So dramatic," Tessa said, glancing at the machines and then back at me. "You totaled your car for what?" "A few cracked ribs and a sprain. That thing was junk anyway." She smiled like she'd made a clever joke. My mother chuckled softly without looking up. I stayed still. My throat burned too badly to speak, and honestly, I didn't trust myself to say anything that wouldn't make things worse. I had learned a long time ago that silence was safer around them. Tessa leaned closer, eyes flicking to the monitor. "This beeping is annoying," she said. "Honestly, you always fake being sick. You've been doing it since we were kids." Before I could process what she was doing, her hand reached out and yanked the cord free. The screen went dark. The room fell silent in a way that felt wrong. Final. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I was too tired, too hurt, too used to being dismissed to even react. A strange thought crossed my mind then. Quiet and terrifying. Maybe this is how people lose their minds. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, when no one believes them. What none of us realized was that the door to my room hadn't fully closed. The nurse stepped in calmly, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply said, "You're not leaving. I've called the police." Tessa went pale like she'd been dumped in cold water. My mother's mouth opened, then closed again. Then came the excuses. She didn't mean anything by it. She was just upset. "It's been a stressful week." The nurse didn't respond. She reconnected the monitor, checked my IV, and stepped back into the hallway. Snorts. I could hear footsteps already moving fast, radios crackling. Tessa started pacing. "You're making this into a thing," she said. "She's fine. Look at her." I couldn't answer. My chest felt like it was caving in, and I couldn't tell whether it was from the accident or from being trapped in the same room with them. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers walked in. 1 woman, 1 man. They spoke to the nurse first, then to me. The female officer asked if I felt safe. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. That was enough. They told my sister and mother they were being detained for interfering with medical equipment and threatening a patient under hospital care. I watched both of them stumble over their words, deny everything, blame each other, and finally go silent as security escorted them out. The door clicked shut behind them. And for the first time since the crash, I didn't feel like I was the problem. I thought the worst part would be watching them get escorted out like criminals. But the relief didn't last long enough to settle into my bones. The moment the door clicked shut, the room felt bigger and emptier. And for a few minutes, I just lay there listening to the monitor beep again, like it was trying to convince me I was still safe. My hands trembled under the blanket. Not because I was cold, but because my body was finally catching up to what almost happened. I stared at the ceiling and tried to slow my breathing. And it hit me all at once that if the nurse hadn't been standing outside, if she hadn't heard the cord rip free, there would have been no witness. Just me, flatlining in silence while my sister stood there pretending it was nothing. A different nurse came in not long after, older, kinder eyes. the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much to be surprised by anything. She adjusted my IV, checked my vitals, and asked if I wanted a social worker. I didn't answer. I didn't know what I wanted. I knew what I didn't want, though. I didn't want them back in that room. I didn't want my mother's voice telling me I was overreacting. I didn't want my sister's smirk hovering over me like I was a problem she couldn't wait to solve. About half an hour later, a doctor walked in who wasn't the rushed ER resident who stitched me up. This one moved slower, more deliberate, as if she had already read my entire life between the lines of my chart. Her name tag read, Dr. Connor. She asked if I was in pain. I said I was fine, mostly because fine was the easiest word to give when you're too exhausted to offer anything more complicated. She pulled up a chair, and the way she sat told me she didn't come in here to talk about bruises. She told me something I hadn't expected at all. Apparently, what happened with the monitor wasn't the first time my sister had been flagged for inappropriate behavior in the hospital. While I'd been unconscious, Tessa had tried to access my chart by claiming she was my primary emergency contact. She was denied, but came back later and tried again with a different nurse. When that didn't work, she changed tactics. She started telling staff I had a long history of attention-seeking behavior. She tried to convince them I was exaggerating symptoms. She suggested my pain medication was unnecessary. Dr. Connor's voice stayed steady while she explained it, but I could hear the edge beneath it, like even she was struggling to keep professional distance. Then she mentioned my mother. She had been recorded on hospital cameras multiple times, rolling her eyes, making faces behind the nurses' backs, mocking the way I was breathing. Small gestures that would sound petty if you describe them out loud. Except petty becomes dangerous when you're the one lying in a bed, unable to defend yourself. The hospital had documentation, witness statements, timestamps. Dr. Connor asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I stared at the wall while she spoke because anger wasn't what I felt. Anger would have meant I still believed this was new. What I felt was colder, like something in me was finally letting go, of the hope that maybe deep down they cared. I'd spent years telling myself my sister was just sharp, my mother was just stressed, that they didn't mean it the way it sounded. That was the lie I kept alive to survive them. Now the hospital was telling me it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. That night, I was moved to a quieter floor away from the general ward into a smaller room near the end of the hall. The nurse said it was standard for trauma patients, but I could see the truth in her eyes when she said it. This wasn't just recovery, it was protection. The hospital didn't trust my family, neither did I. When my phone was finally returned to me the next morning, it was inside a plastic bag with my wallet and watch. The battery was nearly dead, but when it powered on, it lit up like a warning sign. 32 missed calls, 17 voicemails, 6 texts in a row from Tessa, all sent around 3:00 in the morning, swinging between rage and panic. I can't believe you let them arrest us. Call me now before this gets worse. You're ruining everything. Each message got sharper, more desperate, as if the more she typed, the more she could force reality to bend back into place. My mother's messages were different, shorter, controlled. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Stop making this public. You're hurting the family. She kept using the word family like it was a shield, like it erased what happened the moment she said it. By noon, my Aunt Laura called me crying. She said she'd heard something. Not all of it, just enough to be scared. My mother had already called her, telling her I set them up, that I was making a scene in the hospital, that I was unstable, and trying to ruin the family's name while I was doped up on pain meds. My aunt's voice shook as she asked me if any of it was true. I told her the truth, not even all of it. Just the part about the unplugged monitor, the nurse hearing everything, the police coming in. I told her the doctor said it was documented. I told her I didn't even have the strength to argue, and that was the part that scared me the most, that they would do something like this when I couldn't fight back. There was a long pause on the line, and then my aunt said quietly, "Oh my God," not like she was shocked, like she was finally seeing something she should have seen years ago. Later that day, my cousin Rachel texted me screenshots from the family chat. People were choosing sides already. Some relatives said I was doing too much. Some said I should have handled it privately. A few said Tessa was just emotional and my mother was just worried. But there were also messages that made my stomach turn for a different reason. Relatives admitting they'd seen Tessa behave like this for years and were just too polite to say anything. People confessing they knew my mother twisted stories and played victim and they'd always ignored it because it was easier than dealing with her. That part hurt more than the accident because it meant I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. They knew. They all knew. And they let it keep happening because it was convenient. 2 days later, I was discharged. Still sore, still stiff, still sleeping in broken chunks. The hospital staff moved with a kind of careful awareness around me, like they didn't want to startle an animal that had been cornered too long. I didn't tell anyone which day I was leaving. I didn't post about it. I didn't answer my mother's calls. I thought secrecy would buy me a clean exit. It didn't. As a nurse wheeled me toward the entrance, I saw them waiting outside. Tessa leaned against the railing, staring at her phone like she was bored. My mother held a grocery bag with flowers and a cheap balloon that read "Well soon," smiling like nothing had happened, like this was a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a soft tone and props. "We didn't mean for it to get so far," my mother said, stepping closer. I didn't respond. I didn't take the flowers. I didn't even slow down. The nurse's hands tightened on the wheelchair handles, and I felt her hesitation like she was waiting for me to give permission for what came next. My mother walked alongside the chair anyway, half jogging to keep up, saying I was overreacting, that I was making a private issue public, that I was punishing them for one misunderstanding. Tessa smirked like she couldn't wait to tell the story later, like she was already rehearsing how she'd make herself look innocent. The nurse's face stayed neutral, but her eyes weren't. She had seen this dynamic before. She didn't look shocked. She looked tired. I got into the car without saying a word. They didn't follow me into it, but they stood there watching as I pulled away, and I could feel it in my chest, the certainty that the hospital had only been the beginning. They had been stopped in public. They had been embarrassed, and people like them don't accept embarrassment quietly. They retaliate. By the time I got home, I didn't unpack. My suitcase sat in the hallway like a warning. I moved from room to room, checking locks, pulling curtains, turning on lights, even during the day. Every car that passed made my stomach tighten. Every silence felt like it was holding its breath. It wasn't paranoia. It was experience. And the first sign came in the form of a voicemail from my landlord. He said someone had called asking about updates to my lease agreement. He hadn't thought much of it until the woman on the phone started pushing for a copy of my key. When he asked for ID verification, she hung up. He didn't get a name, but she said she was my sister. I didn't have to ask which one. I didn't call my sister back. I didn't call my mother either. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone in my hand long after the landlord's voicemail ended, staring at the wall like it might explain how things had escalated this far. The hospital felt unreal now, like a sealed chapter I could pretend was over. But the call about my key told me something important. They weren't finished. They were just changing tactics. The next call I made was to my bank, then another bank, then the small credit union I barely used anymore, the one I'd opened years ago when my mother had hip surgery and I needed a shared account to cover her medical expenses. Back then, it felt practical, even loving. Now it felt like a trap I'd laid for myself and forgotten about. When I logged in and saw the balance, my stomach dropped. The joint account was down to 800 and change. It had been over 10,000 the last time I checked, maybe 3 months earlier. I refreshed the screen like the numbers might correct themselves. They didn't. There were withdrawals and transfers, 2 large ones spaced just far enough apart to avoid triggering a fraud alert. $3,000 here, $3,000 there. Clean, legal, intentional. I didn't even bother calling my mother to ask. I closed the account immediately and started pulling my name off everything I could remember. Credit cards, shared utilities, old authorizations I hadn't thought about in years. Each click felt like ripping out a wire that had been quietly draining me. That afternoon, I ordered security cameras. One for the front porch, one for the side door, one inside the living room facing the entryway. I hated the idea of it. Hated that I even had to think this way. But I hated the alternative more. I didn't want to be the woman on the news people said should have seen it coming. The technician arrived the next morning, polite, professional, asking if I'd had break-ins before. I told him to make sure everything uploaded to the cloud. That was all the answer he needed. That night, I slept for more than 4 hours for the first time since the accident. The kind of heavy sleep that makes you forget where you are until the sound pulls you back. The bang came just after midnight. Not a knock, a dull, solid thud like a shoulder hitting the door. Then another, then my name. I didn't move. I stayed crouched behind the couch with my phone in my hand, already dialing. I recognized the voices immediately. Tessa first, loud and sharp, demanding I open the door. My mother closed behind her, calmer, controlled, telling me not to make this worse, that we could talk like adults, that I owed them that much. I didn't answer. The operator told me to stay where I was, not to engage, to wait. Through the live feed on my phone, I watched Tessa pace on the porch. At one point, she picked up a brick from the edge of the garden bed and weighed it in her hand. My chest went tight in a way I couldn't breathe through. She didn't throw it right away. She just held it like she was deciding how far she was willing to go. The police arrived faster than I expected. No sirens, just headlights washing over the driveway. An officer stepped between them and my door without asking many questions. He told them to leave. They tried to act casual like they were just checking on me, but they backed away when he didn't budge. They didn't go far. They sat in a car across the street for almost an hour watching my house like they were waiting for something to change. That's when I called my Uncle Alan and my Aunt Lorna. I told them everything this time. Not the softened version, not the careful one. I told them about the hospital, the bank account, the landlord, the brick in my sister's hand. They didn't hesitate. They drove over that night with overnight bags like this wasn't a question, like it was a decision already made. My aunt went straight to the kitchen and started making tea. My uncle checked the locks without saying a word and told me he'd stay up for a while. The next morning brought a new kind of violation. I walked into the kitchen and stopped cold. The cabinet door hung crooked from one hinge. Every dish inside shattered across the floor. It wasn't an accident. The window above the sink was forced open just enough to let in a hand or a tool. My aunt swept in silence while my uncle examined the frame. His jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. While they worked, my phone buzzed with an email that made my hands go numb. Subject line: confirmation of beneficiary change. It was from my life insurance provider. I hadn't logged into that account in years. The email said a request had been submitted to remove me as the primary beneficiary and replace it with my mother. The change hadn't gone through because the digital signature didn't match, but the attempt alone was enough to make me feel sick. I showed my aunt first. She read it without speaking, then handed it to my uncle. When she finally looked back at me, she asked a question that landed heavier than anything else. Had I ever told them about the policy? I remembered a dinner from 2 years earlier. My mother making a comment about being prepared. Tessa joking that if I died, she hoped she'd get the car. They remembered. Of course they did. My uncle got on the phone with a lawyer he trusted before I could even process what that meant. When he handed me the phone, the questions came fast. Had I filed a police report? Did they have access to my finances? Were they listed as medical proxies? Did the hospital document the monitor incident? When I told him everything, there was a pause on the line, then a sentence that made my skin prickle. This wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. This was a pattern that looked dangerously close to something criminal. By the end of the day, every account I had was closed or moved. Locks were changed again. Extra bolts installed. My aunt texted relatives quietly, telling them not to share information if my mother or sister reached out. That night, my phone buzzed with another security alert. Motion detected at the front porch just after midnight. I opened the app and saw a man I didn't recognize standing just out of frame. Hoodie, jeans, phone to his ear. He paced slowly, then looked directly at my door and said my name. Not shouting, not threatening like he expected me to answer. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He stayed 2 more minutes, then walked back to a car I didn't recognize and drove away. I didn't sleep after that. I just watched the footage on loop until my aunt came into the room and asked why I was still awake. When she saw the video, she didn't ask who he was. She just said quietly that we should have stopped them years ago. By morning, my uncle had already forwarded the footage of the man on my porch to the police and flagged it with the lawyer he'd contacted the night before. I gave a short written statement confirming I didn't know him, hadn't expected anyone, and hadn't shared my address with anyone outside of close family. The officer on the phone told me to keep my doors locked and not to engage if he returned. It didn't feel like a plan so much as a pause, but my uncle had something else in mind. He called a meeting, not with the people causing the chaos, but with the ones who mattered. 3 of his siblings, 2 cousins, and 1 business partner met us that afternoon in my aunt's living room. I sat on the edge of the couch wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like hospital disinfectant while my uncle laid everything out piece by piece. The hospital report, the unplugged monitor, the attempt to access my medical records, the drained joint account, the life insurance beneficiary change, the man at my door who knew my name. Each detail landed heavier than the last. No one interrupted him. No one tried to soften it. What shocked me wasn't that he had records. It was that he wasn't the only one. My cousin Abby admitted my mother had called her days earlier, asking if she knew how much I might have inherited from our grandfather. There was no inheritance, just assumptions. But hearing it said out loud made my stomach twist. Someone asked if we thought the man on my porch had been sent to scare me. I said I didn't know, only that he looked calm, too calm. That was when the room went quiet. My uncle didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply made a few calls. By evening, the process had started to remove both my mother and Tessa from the family business account, an LLC they had no real role in, but still collected dividends from. He also froze the small trust our grandfather had set up for family emergencies, the one they dipped into for years, using guilt and stories about needing help. He told me to stop worrying, that it was being handled. But I could see the strain in his face. He knew this wouldn't end cleanly. He was right. That night around 8:45, they showed up again. No warning, no apology. My mother held a folder like it proved something. Tessa pushed past the threshold before anyone could stop her. They weren't there to talk. They were there to reclaim control. My mother accused me of poisoning the family, of exaggerating everything, to play the victim. Tessa knocked over a lamp and said I was turning everyone against them. When my aunt told them to leave, my mother snapped that she was just trying to take my money too. That was when my uncle stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He said one sentence calm and clear, loud enough for everyone to hear. If you say one more word, I will have you cut out of every remaining contract, every asset, every dollar tied to this family. My mother froze. Tessa opened her mouth, then stopped when my uncle raised a finger and said, "No more. We're done protecting you from yourselves." He turned to me and asked a question no one had ever asked me before. "Do you want them here?" I said no. And for the first time in my life, someone listened. They were told to leave, or the police would be called again. My aunt stood between me and the door until they backed out. No screaming, no tears, just 2 people realizing the one thing they valued most. Access was gone. That night, I slept on the couch while my aunt made tea and my uncle changed the locks again. Even though they'd never had keys, I stared out the window for a long time, not because I expected them to return, but because I finally believed they might not. The fear didn't vanish overnight. Even after they were gone, even after the locks were changed and the house finally went quiet, my body stayed braced like something else was coming. Safety felt temporary, like a thin sheet stretched over something fragile. I slept, but lightly. Every sound outside made me open my eyes. Every vibration of my phone sent a jolt through me before I even looked at the screen. The next morning, While my aunt made coffee and my uncle checked in with the lawyer again, I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I opened my laptop and started looking up apartments in other cities. Not nearby ones, not places my mother might accidentally pass through. Quiet cities, smaller ones, places where no one knew my last name and no one had expectations of me. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. Not yet. Just scrolling felt like a form of breathing. By the end of the week, the restraining order paperwork was filed. The hospital documentation was attached. Police reports were cross-referenced. My lawyer explained it all in calm, careful language, but the meaning underneath was unmistakable. What happened to me wasn't just family drama. It was a documented pattern of interference, intimidation, and attempted control. Seeing it written that way made something inside me ache. Not because I wanted them punished, but because I finally understood how serious it had always been. A few days later, my uncle sat me down and asked a question I didn't expect. "Do you want to stay here?" he said. "Or do you want to leave?" He didn't frame it like a test or a suggestion. He framed it like a choice I was allowed to make. I told him I wanted to leave. We didn't make a big announcement. There was no group message explaining anything, no social media post, no goodbye tour. Early one morning, before the sun was fully up, I packed one suitcase with the things I couldn't replace. Everything else was donated, sold, or left behind. My uncle drove ahead with a rented trailer, carrying a few pieces of secondhand furniture we bought quickly. My aunt followed in her car with blankets, snacks, and a thermos of coffee like we were going on a normal road trip. We weren't. It felt closer to an evacuation. The apartment was 2 hours away. Small, older, not charming, but it had working locks, quiet neighbors, and a layout that didn't echo with memories. That was enough. The first night, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and listened to the building settle. No yelling, no footsteps outside my door, no voices saying my name like they owned it. I didn't sleep much at first. The silence was too clean, too unfamiliar. I kept my phone face down, waiting for something bad to happen. Nothing did. Days turned into weeks. I started going for short walks around the block, then longer ones. I bought a small table and 2 chairs from a thrift store. My uncle helped hang blackout curtains. My aunt filled my pantry like I was moving into a dorm room, labeling containers and pretending not to notice when I got quiet. They visited often, but never pushed. They didn't ask me how I was healing. They didn't tell me what I should feel. They just showed up. And that alone felt like something I'd never had before. The restraining order held. No violations, no strange cars, no unknown numbers calling in the middle of the night. I heard nothing directly from my mother or my sister. Again, that didn't mean they disappeared. It just meant they stopped reaching me. I heard through my cousin Abby once through a number I didn't recognize. She said, "You were right. I didn't want to see it before. I do now." I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because I was done explaining myself. I worked remotely, quietly. Nothing impressive, nothing dramatic, just steady. I saved more than I ever had. I cooked for myself. I learned which grocery store had the best bread. Some days were still heavy. Grief doesn't vanish just because danger does. I grieved the idea of a mother who protected me, a sister who didn't compete with me, a family that didn't treat love like leverage. That grief came in waves, but it passed. It always passed. One evening, my aunt and I sat on the small balcony drinking tea. She looked out over the parking lot and asked if I was happy. I didn't answer right away. Happiness felt like too big a word, but I told her I felt like myself for the first time in a very long time. Not the version of me that stayed quiet to survive. Not the one who absorbed blame to keep peace, just me. And that was enough. I stopped wondering what version of the story they were telling other people. I stopped caring. What mattered was that they didn't know where I lived, who I worked for, or who I was becoming. The silence that once terrified me now felt like space. Real space. the kind you can grow into. I am Ginger J. Bradley, and for the first time in my life, I am